Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark the Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey Voorhees Knockreiner.
What?
I didn't know if you would get it, and our listeners may not either, but look at the recording day today, Mark. This comes out on Monday for our listeners, but we are recording this on Friday the 13th. I assume you have some pretty scary security stories for us. Go with the theme.
Today's a happy episode. We're going to start with how Microsoft hopes to turn the entire Endpoint anti-malware ecosystem on its head with removing kernel access. We'll then dive into a phishing campaign that used a super interesting, and maybe not super interesting, very interesting command and control method. And then end with the US federal government's latest push to try and employ as many people in cyber as possible. With that,
cool. I think we should put on our hockey masks and go axe our way in.
That sounds great. So let's start with the first story today, which is a follow-up from that no good, very bad day back in July when a EDR vendor took out several million Windows endpoints with a software update, unfortunately.
Oopsie.
Yep. So if you remember back in July, CrowdStrike put out a update that affected or triggered a vulnerability, maybe not a vulnerability, a bug in their kernel module, which caused Windows machines to blue screen in a way that was basically unrecoverable without hands-on keyboard access back to them. So in the wake of that, it kind of re-stirred the hornet's nest on folks having discussions about is giving kernel level access to Windows really the best approach? Because in comparison, Mac OS with Apple is significantly more restrictive on the level of access that they give, both on Mac OS and iOS for the mobile devices too. And so it really caused people to step back and have a discussion or thoughts on, is that type of model appropriate for Windows now also? So Microsoft, to their credit, just hosted a summit on September 10th, which they called the Windows Endpoint Security Ecosystem Summit, which they said was to discuss the resilience improvement strategies in the wake of that event back in July. And they just published a blog post a couple of days ago where they went over a few of the main discussion points for the event in the name of transparency. They started out by saying that there was key consensus points that everyone agreed on, that there are benefits to customers and the ecosystem when there are options for Windows and in choices of security products. I think this probably has to go without saying. It also feels like I don't think Microsoft is wanting to get bit by the FTC again, or FCC. FTC, Federal Trade, it's FTC. On antitrust by locking down anti-malware on Windows. But it's good that they at least affirmatively acknowledge that, yes, we should have a choice for endpoint protection on Windows. They then said the summit went into a discussion of Microsoft's own safe deployment practices for Defender and Windows themselves. They went through a few examples from them and other vendors on how they handle development, certification, testing, beta, and phased release with rollback controls along the way to try and limit the opportunity for a July-like incident from occurring again. But then the discussion shifted to what is the elephant in the room, which is kernel mode access for third parties. So if you remember from all the discussions we've had on the podcast from this, kernel level access is driver level access above what a typical user would have on a machine, even above what an administrator would have on a system. Historically, endpoint protection tools have had this level of access because malware can potentially get this level of access. And in theory, the only way to detect and prevent that type of activity is to be on the same level as them, to put it simply. But it comes with risks. If there's a bug that causes a crash in a kernel level program or a memory issue in a kernel level program, it has to blue screen the whole machine because otherwise you could potentially impact the memory of the entire operating system, which would be catastrophic potentially. So some of the things they discussed were basically, first off, saying both the customers and partners in the ecosystem have called on Microsoft for additional security capabilities outside kernel mode, maybe to remove some of that necessity. And then focus on a few things like performance requirements for tools that interact outside of the kernel mode, anti-tampering protection for security products, security sensor requirements, development and collaboration principles between Microsoft and the ecosystem, and just general secure by design initiatives. And I think a few of these are interesting and important. Like, it would be very easy for Microsoft to say, okay, endpoint malware no longer gets kernel level access, or sorry, endpoint malware protection no longer gets kernel level access. They have to go through our APIs here. But then what if Microsoft gives their own tools like slightly better APIs?
Better
like
access,
I can see
yeah.
why that would be an important thing to discuss.
I'm also glad that they're considering, and the ecosystem partners probably brought this to the highlight, things like anti-tampering. I think you and I at the highest generic level are okay with non-kernel level access as long as all security controls have equal APIs to more securely have the access they need to do what they want. But you also have to protect the endpoint product. And might be, I bet you that problem will be interesting, because making something of a kernel mode privilege is one of the easiest ways to protect against anti-tampering for things that aren't of that level. So I'm glad they're thinking about that, because malware already is trying to disable security controls, let alone users. So the anti-tampering part is good that it's part of their consideration.
And then I think like even the performance thing is an important feature too. Like right now, if you'd have to go interact through a like operating system API, that introduces additional latency, and that can cause issues with detection then if you're going slower than what the malware has access to.
Yep.
But I don't envy Microsoft and all the other people, including the folks internally at WatchGuard for our endpoint tool, that are
Absolutely.
trying to have these discussions and figure out a plan for the future. This is going to be a substantial overhaul of like how Microsoft Windows works in order to lock down some of this in a way while still allowing access for endpoint protection.
Yeah, it's a good thing to do, but as you say, I suspect it is actually a long bowl of work, and all the endpoint companies will have to reprogram a lot of things to work a little differently. But it'd be interesting. Hopefully, it's an opportunity to increase. I don't know, maybe introduce new mechanics into the operating system that will make it easier to tell good processes from bad processes too. We'll see. Generally, I think it's a good step to take, though. We do not want that sort of CrowdStrike crash to happen to any of us.
No, but they also like even at the end of their discussion for like, okay, maybe we pull stuff out of the kernel. They did turn back and say there's actually some things that like customers and vendors need to do in this space as well too. Like for customers, they talked about the necessity for a good business continuity plan or an incident response plan for a major event. And so while yes, this was one vendor causing a bad day for a lot of people, like some companies responded and recovered way better than others. Like, crap, I know we've beat this under the bush, but look at like Delta compared to American Airlines. Or I think it was United that was also impacted by this, where two of them recovered relatively quickly over the course of the day, and Delta it took them a week. And you could point to, I mean, maybe we'll get an after action report on why that was the case, but if I had to guess, I'd say a lot of reliance on this type of tool, not enough hands-on keyboard available to go recover from it, and probably just not a business continuity plan in place that anticipated all your Windows machines crashing and becoming unrecoverable.
And you've heard us talk about business continuity before. It's a hard thing. No company's perfect at it. I'm not going to throw stones, and we do have good business continuity here, but there's always little things that you have to figure out and exceptions. But regardless of what we're talking about, I think a lot of security experts need to focus more on business continuity than they do on prevention, frankly. at least if they don't have a mature plan. Because at the end of the day, we're definitely here to prevent attacks, but I don't think it's realistic to ever prevent every attack, let alone disaster, by the way. There's lots of other things that could take down a lot of computers that aren't cyber attacks. So the most important job I think a CISO can do, or the security professional at an organization, is make sure their business has a solid plan to survive if any of their infrastructure goes down, or more importantly, making sure their infrastructure has enough backups at other places, et cetera, et cetera. So, no, I agree with you. I thought that it was good customer advice. They do have a link that we showed on the screen for a second to a Microsoft blog page that talks about cyber resiliency, or in this case, Windows resiliency, but the industry's been calling this cyber resiliency. That has a lot of best practices. I would say if you're a security person, you probably know all of these best practices, but I think what happens in our industry is business continuity plans get deprioritized for things like prevention and immediate firefighting. So just a reminder that you should take, any time you take for this planning, even though, you may not use this plan for the next 4 years. That's why people deprioritize it and forget to maintain it, because yes, it's not something that happens every day, but the second it happens, being without this is going to be your biggest problem. So take a little time to do that as well.
And definitely, yeah, like you said, tabletop exercises are a great way to make sure that your business continuity plan will actually work when it matters too. You don't need to go into the server room and unplug everything to test the plan. You can walk through an exercise of, if this happens, what would we do? And find
It doesn't
gaps
have to
along the
be
way that way.
technical. It can be more scenarios and making sure the leaders walk through their playbooks of who to call, what they would say. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, my favorite example was one of our business continuity tabletop exercises where the scenario was Godzilla came out of the ocean and ate our data center in Japan. What do we do in that situation? And even something, extreme and funny like that can still lead to good discussions on how do you recover from a catastrophic incident like that in an entire region. That's obviously a little more applicable for global companies like us than, the small organizations or smaller organizations that may listen to this. But either way, take nothing away. Like, test your business continuity plan with an exercise is critical.
Yep.
So moving on, a couple weeks ago, Proofpoint published a research article about a new malware campaign with a pretty novel command and control layer. And I had this thing bookmarked forever and finally got around to reading it. And it turned out to be pretty dang interesting. We're now even a couple weeks after the fact. I
Yeah,
think it's still worth talking about. So this
absolutely.
whole thing started in early August. I think they said August 5th, when Proofpoint, who's the email security organization, saw around 20,000 messages impacting 70 organizations globally involved in this specific campaign. They noted it started with a few hundred messages daily, but then spiked on August 17th to 6,000 daily messages. And these messages claim to be from tax authorities, including those from the US, UK, France, Germany, and others. And they were used to deliver a malware campaign or malware payload that the threat actors themselves seem to have called Voldemort, in both strings throughout the malware and file names that it uses throughout it. And so we'll get into the command and control in a bit, but going through like the actual technical analysis was pretty interesting. Like, first off, it started as a phishing campaign. This is how Proofpoint saw it. And one thing that stood out to me, they were using tax authorities as the hook, basically saying, here's some document related to your tax something. And they were picking their victims. So like individual
It was
organization, let's
global
say
though, so it
it was
wasn't
global.
just like yeah.
So they were picking, like, let's say Mark at WatchGuard. And they were even crafting these messages to be towards the victim itself, their region versus like the global company. Like, for example, certain targets in a multinational European company were receiving emails that were impersonating the US IRS because the
They were
publicly available
US.
information for the victim said that they were in
Yeah.
the US, even though their company was in Europe. That was I mean, that happens probably all the time, but it's interesting seeing it tailored towards the victim and not just the
Yeah.
organization
It just
itself.
shows the fish, the spear part of the fish, that they are doing some work. Although I'm sure you'll get to the next part, whereas it was interesting that that also might have helped tell people it was fraudulent because they occasionally made mistakes.
It mentioned that in a few cases, the public information for their victims seemed to have been misassociated with a more public presence that was incorrect. And so sometimes they did get the wrong tax authority as the hook. When they looked at the victim verticals, the around 50% of them in total were made up of insurance, aerospace, transportation, and higher education, with the rest being a whole bunch of other verticals. Insurance was the largest by volume at like 25%. So the hook itself, it was a phishing email with a link that used Google AMP as a caching layer to then ultimately redirect the victim to the free web hosting platform called Infinity Free. That link contained another link to view a document when clicked. That when the victim clicks on it, it fingerprints their browser, like the user agent, the IP address they're connecting from, and then based off the user agent, does one of two different things. So if it contained Windows in the agent, meaning they're most likely on a Windows machine, it redirected them to a search-ms URI protocol handler. So if you remember protocol handlers, it's the way you can launch something in an application. It's like HTTP launches in web browsers, Zoom launches in the Zoom meeting application. In this case, search-ms launches in Windows Explorer on the desktop. The little pop-up, if they would, so actually behind the scenes, it would also like load an image to be able to fingerprint even more from their browser too, based off the content loading. If it wasn't Windows, it would redirect them to a Google Drive URL that had that same image to gather info. So if the user accepts opening Windows Explorer, so it pops up that shortcut saying this wants to open in Windows Explorer, it would use a built-in like saved search that resulted in a file in there that looks like it's sitting in your downloads directory. It looks like a PDF, but in reality, it's a .lnk shortcut file hosted on some remote web file sharing service, like over SMB. It's pretty nuts. They were using WebDAV, which is a like HTTP protocol extension for file editing, to host a lot of the dependencies on this. But basically, if you click that shortcut, it would kick off PowerShell, load up Python, download all the Python dependencies required from a WebDAV endpoint. That script would execute, gather information about the endpoint. It downloads a decoy PDF that it then opens, so it looks like you actually opened a PDF, but behind the scenes, it downloads a password-protected zip file from OpenDrive file sharing service, extracts two files, one called Cisco collabhost.exe and one called Cisco sparklauncher.dll. That executable, it's just a legitimate copy of a Cisco application, but it's used to sideload that DLL, which is a malicious DLL. That DLL has some exported DLL names like Voldemort G Drive DLL. That's where the name comes from. It's got some anti-sandboxing detection in there, including sleeping for a bit with a little bit of jitter to evade sandbox detections. But it ultimately beacons back home off a really interesting command and control channel using Google Sheets. So basically hosted spreadsheets on Google's Office platform, where it would use built-in credentials to authenticate to Google and then look for a specific spreadsheet effectively, read through the cells on it to find an open cell, and then start writing data back to it that it exfiltrated from the host. It would also look for specific cells to get commands to execute. For example, it could like ping or download a file or upload a file, run a command with exec, copy, move, sleep, exit, anything, all through Google Sheets as a command and control interface for this. They went into some more details on that saved search, which was interesting. So that search.ms protocol handler, you can pipe like a whole bunch of parameters through it. And the parameters basically like modified the Windows Explorer window to really hide what was going on behind the scenes. So the reality was this was a link that pointed to an SMB file share out there on the internet with actually quite a few different files on it. But in the Windows Explorer view, it manually edited it so it looks like you're in just the downloads directory. It even manually modified the view for the file itself, like in the little window, so that it would hide all the artifacts that would show it was hosted on another site and just show the file name itself. It modified the search condition to only show a single file on that share, even though others existed. And it even changed the author name of that file to match the name of the individual that was the victim from this actual attack. So when you like hover over it, it shows your victim name as the author, meaning it does look like you just downloaded something into the downloads directory, as opposed to now you're connected to a remote file share with something hidden in there for you to access. That was almost as cool from a perspective, like a
dangerous,
from a scary perspective, almost as cool as using Google Sheets as a command and control channel.
It's definitely some very sneaky technical social engineering techniques. I mean, it's technical techniques to allow this, but that whole pop-up looking like it's your directory is social engineering in a technical way, in my opinion.
It's pretty cool.
And the Google Sheets for the C2 is, on one hand, I bet you it's easy C2 for researchers to find once they know about it, but it's a non-standard C2. So kind of from security in the threat actor's standpoint, I do always find it interesting when they use novel C2s, because a lot of security controls aren't really going to pay attention too much to what's going on in Google Sheets, I don't think.
I mean, maybe most organizations aren't going to exactly block docs.google.com.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's a way to at least guarantee that as long as your account as the threat actor remains active, you can really keep using this channel, because it's going to be extremely difficult to you can't just block that. Yeah. You would have to rely
one
on
thing
Google.
I found interesting, by the way, was early on, Proofpoint thought this looked like maybe some red teaming, maybe some custom red teaming, and they obviously changed their mind on that eventually. But for attribution, they suspect this is APT-ish, but it doesn't seem like they have enough to really attribute it yet.
Yep, they said strictly based off like the volume of messages, the 20,000 messages, and some of their analysis of the malware itself, that changed their mind that it wasn't an APT or it wasn't a red team, and now they think it is an APT.
I think there was, Cobalt Strike payloads associated with it, which I think at first might make you think red teaming, but it's also interesting to me to see Cobalt Strike being used more in malware. I think we've talked about it before. It's like to really get it, it's a very paid for commercial package. I wonder if there's any way to fingerprint people through it eventually. But I do know there's been pirated versions of it in the past, but my understanding is it's much harder to find updated versions that are pirated. So it is interesting to see potential real threat actors using paid for pen testing, or at least considered good guy tools.
It's because it's effective. Like, it's probably one of the
Cobalt
best
Strike is great.
red team like engagement tools you can have for setting up a command and control beacon, and that is why threat actors use it. But either way, I mean, at the end of the day, this still relied on a phishing lure that someone had to fall for. They had to be tricked into opening Explorer, which is abnormal behavior from your web browser. Generally, your browser does not try and prompt you to open Windows Explorer, so that should have been another red flag. The icon, even though the icon looked like a PDF, it still clearly said shortcut. So there's enough red flags that with a good enough like training program, you can probably have a chance at catching this. But at the same time, like, relying on users not falling for a fish is a losing game. And that is where good endpoint protection will help out too. Because at the end of the day, this executed a malicious PowerShell script, downloaded a malicious library, and ran it. And all of those are easily detected by any EDR worth its salt.
Interesting. Very cool. It'd be interesting to see if they learn. I mean, we don't want anyone to be affected by this, but we do find it kind of interesting when they use new technical techniques that are effective. And it's very cool to learn about them, because then you can be aware to protect them. But It'd be interesting to see if any other organizations or Proofpoint continues to learn more about this threat actor.
Agreed. So moving on though, for the last story, earlier this month, the White House unveiled its Service for America campaign with a goal of connecting more Americans to jobs in cybersecurity, both federal jobs and even private sector jobs as well too. And this was basically just a giant announcement and campaign slash program built around a whole bunch of smaller initiatives that are all happening in a pretty short period of time. It includes some career fairs for federal jobs through the end of October, a bunch of seminars for job seekers on how to navigate the federal government job application process, which is a nightmare from what I've heard, workshops from NIST and other education institutes on exploring cybersecurity careers, and then like hundreds of individual events from just other organizations, entities, education places, and everything. So if Corey can pull up his screen real quick, they point to 500,000 unfilled cybersecurity jobs globally as like the main driver for this. Actually, 500,000 unfilled cybersecurity jobs just in the United States itself as the main driver for this. And the challenge about filling those jobs was what they're really trying to address. They lean pretty heavily on, so NIST has their NICE program, which is their National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education program, which is basically a way to help guide people that want to get into cybersecurity through paths to get there. They point to this really cool tool that CISA has that I hadn't seen before that Corey's showing right now on the video, which is their NICE framework for work roles. And it's basically this giant like interactive matrix of 5 different areas leading from like IT, including cybersecurity itself and other adjacent areas like intelligence. And it maps out like all the different relations between different jobs you can have. So for example, if you're currently a systems administrator, what are good jobs in like cybersecurity or governance that are an easy transition for you? If you're doing like incident response, what's the next step for you from that role? It's a pretty cool matrix to show you like different paths you can take based off of specific like job roles, not just in cybersecurity, but in related fields as well too. I really like this type of content. Like I think cybersecurity can be a pretty confusing and complex field to navigate in. A lot of people just think, I want to go hack stuff, and without realizing there's like, does that mean you want to do penetration testing? Does that mean you want to do red teaming? Does that mean you want to do like vulnerability analysis? Like there's so many different niches to find your way into.
There's for the people that don't like to read, there's a video that the White House National Cybersecurity Director Coker has up there. And one of the things I noticed he said that is something we've talked about, folks getting more people in cybersecurity, getting diversity in cybersecurity, schooling about it. But one of the things that he said is something I've said before is not all the roles are technical. Like there's this myth that to be in cybersecurity, you probably should either be a coder or know networking down to a super level or endpoint forensics. But there's a lot of, governance and communicate. I mean, anyone that moves up in cybersecurity, whether it's someone like Mark, a director of SOC, or a CISO, it ends up being a communication role very heavily too. So I thought it was good that Coker reminded people that they are certainly looking for the technical roles. There's no doubt that there's a lot of technical that we want to fill in cybersecurity too, but there's other types of roles. You don't necessarily have to be technical only for it. Is this like the new recruiting though, Mark? It's like in the future, instead of recruiting for military, are we going to have like draft videos of I don't know, showing gamers and how playing games can relate to? I remember when they started using first person gaming to try to get people to sign up for the army or something.
See, when I first saw this whole campaign and them trying to label cybersecurity as like a national service, my first thought was, does this mean I get to discharge the rest of my student loans because I've now done 10 years of national service?
That would be cool. Actually, if a particular White House wants to to start giving away or start helping pay for education, this is a good kind of win-win situation where they get something for it and maybe have avenue to pay for it.
As much as I joke, like it makes sense that the federal government wants to focus on filling cybersecurity roles. Like it seems like every single week the FBI points out that other hostile nations are beating us like 50 to 1 in terms of just raw headcount in the
Absolutely.
cyberspace. And I think that even was said like if we had literally everyone in the US federal government that works in cybersecurity focused specifically on China, for example, they would still have us beat 50 to 1. And obviously not all of them are focusing on a single country or a single thing. And, raw headcount doesn't always equal raw output, but there is a huge number, not just in the federal government, but in the private sector too, of like unfilled skilled jobs. But
That's what I was going to say. I agree with you from the national perspective why the government wants to do it, but I bet you a lot of just normal private organizations that aren't even considering global or national security are feeling like they don't have enough expertise here. So it's a win-win for everyone. Win-win for
I do have a
nations
hot
that
take
want
though.
to go for it. And
So
I like hot
when it
takes.
comes to the technical roles, I don't think that there are any entry level technical roles in cybersecurity. That's my hot take. So let me expand on that. So a lot of, and my opinion has changed on this, like over even just recent time too. That's where I'm at right now, where a lot of folks will go get a certification in something, or even go through 4 years of university, and then
Yeah.
think they can jump straight into something like even an incident responder role or like a professional penetration testing role. And what I think is missed without experience in even just an IT field that you can transition into is some of the soft skills that do not come along with those types of education paths, and also just the real world.
So what I was
Meaning,
going to ask is so let me follow. I should let you finish first, but like I would assume you at least need to know about network. Let's say you don't have a ton of experience using security controls, you at least need to know how networks work or how
yep.
Windows works. Is that what you're saying they don't have and are not getting an education, or do you just not consider that? To me, I
My
consider all
concern
that
is
technical, and it's not. I agree with you. It's not security related, but it's a base knowledge you have to have if you're going towards a technical security role. You have to know a lot about networking and computing beyond security.
this is where I think my own opinion has evolved over recent times, where I think cybersecurity is less and less about finding and fixing a problem, because you can't fix every single problem. And it's more and more about prioritization and just managing risk and doing what you can. And that is what I feel like coming straight out of a certification, you're not going to have that level of
So you're saying they're missing
knowledge.
kind of the.
Business side, let's
It's not
say.
just. I was going to say business, but I'm not sure if it's just that. But I do agree. At the end of the day, there's a lot to do as a cybersecurity expert, and some has actual value to protecting the business, and some might just be busy work. So
Yep.
I agree that they may not. That is something that I find a lot of technical roles, even in IT, probably don't know at an entry level position, and that is really the kind of experience you mostly only learn at the workplace. And I would say the people that move into leadership in IT are the ones that understand, you know, the ones who move into leadership, they might also be very technically adept and ones that move beyond others technically, but I think it's more important for them to have that as a skill of knowing how to prioritize what's important to whatever organization you're working for, which isn't necessarily what you would like if I were that person, I might think this is the most important security thing to do, but you're not doing it for you. You're doing it for the business. So
And
yeah, I
that's where I
agree
think
with that.
like even
That is,
having
that is not taught, but I think that
a
applies to a
couple,
lot of technical roles. Yeah.
yes, but even having a couple years of just professional experience in a company, not even necessarily cybersecurity, but like in something like IT, even
Yeah.
as like a starting point where you can understand how a organization works, beyond just ones and zeros,
Yeah.
is I think a requirement to move into an actual cybersecurity role at this point. Like at least a one where you're going to have a meaningful impact from day zero, moving
Yeah.
into it.
Makes sense to me.
And I think that's the main limitation for why we have so many unfilled roles, because the majority of those are ones where you do need experience. Like the role, it's a skilled role. And
Yeah.
that is why I think we're having such a hard time, because it's very difficult for
If that's the
fresh
case, though, you
folks
need
to
to
come
find a
in.
way to be able to bring set. Like the thing is, at some point, no one has experience until they work for their first business. So there needs to be
So
some business that has a way of onboarding and getting people up to speed on those skills as they're doing their day job.
this is why I actually like one of the big approaches that like the White House is taking with this whole initiative is they're focusing also on internships and more importantly apprenticeships, where maybe you can get a worker subsidized, and so the lack of experience is a little more palatable because you can afford to train them up thanks to like subsidizing the
Yeah,
subsidy.
subsidies.
And that is a way to build that experience with someone that is fresh, green, out of school or out of a certification.
Yeah, that's cool.
So those types of programs I think are important. Like I'm firmly believe that like experience is more important. Like education is important.
I
Don't
agree.
get me wrong, but I think experience is more important in a professional setting, and getting that
I also
experience is
think
the
the difference
challenge.
is like education can educate you about one topic, but no matter what job, there is things that you can only learn with experience. So experience, but meanwhile, on the flip side, as you're getting experience, you're also can be educated about just about anything. Like if you know how to really things to me like college, it almost matters less what your major is. It just shows you're able to take a topic, learn, pass it to some degree of understanding, and do some work associated with it. So, like, I don't think of the experience you get in college as necessarily having to apply directly to the job. In some cases, for technical stuff, that may be overstating it. But I feel like it just shows you can learn. And that way, when you do get a job, I mean, most jobs you're going to have to learn something on the fly. And so to me, things like college and education are just more proof that this person is able to take a topic and learn enough about it to do some work that passes muster.
Yep. So either way, like all that was a long-winded way of saying I really like that we've got a program, at least a focus over the next month and a half from the US federal government to try and do what they can to fill some of these jobs and get people in a spot where they can fill them.
On the
But
joking side, now that the government's actually doing what we think is a respectable job of paying attention to cybersecurity and information security, I do have to say the amount of time in the video or in all of their documents, they just say cyber, 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 cyber. Like as an industry, I remember when people used to gag and drink at Black Hat and DEF CON every time someone used the word cyber. 10 years later, I think the security industry itself is using cyber. So the government won. Language is fluid.
yeah, 100%. So we'll see. Maybe on October 15th, once this is all said and done, maybe we can get some stats on how much of an actual dent it made on even like federal employment in cybersecurity. I'm sorry, in cyber, not cybersecurity. It's just a single word.
You got to shorten it. People in the White House and in the Congress don't have time for the whole word. And just so
Yeah.
you know, cryptocurrency is now officially crypto, even though cryptography has many meanings. So no cryptocurrency, just say crypto.
Sometimes I hate the profession that I work in. Actually, I'm not going to put that on us. Crypto is not our
Yeah.
problem. That was it's all thanks to the crypto bros ruining
But
that
it
one.
affects us, man, because
It
I
does.
do think people need to understand cryptography, what it really is, not just related to different digital currency.
Yeah.
Anyways, at least there wasn't too much depressing news on this podcast.
Yeah, everything's great except for those poor people that got fished.
Yeah.
Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Instagram at WatchGuard_technologies. Words are hard on Friday the 13th. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.